I predict that no matter who wins the election, if it's not myself, we're going to have a candidate that's going to increase debt and deficits, that's going to have a foreign policy that's going to be rooted in militarism and exporting our value with the bombs, the bullet, and the drone. No matter who wins, I think between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, we'll effectively lose.
Chase Oliver is the 2024 Libertarian Party nominee for president. Traditionally, the US Libertarian Party has been the most successful third party contesting elections in the US. However, they only received about 1.1% of the popular vote in 2020, comparable to Green Party nominee Jill Stein. Oliver previously ran for House and Senate seats in Georgia. Chase Oliver, thank you very much for joining us here on Centre Stage.
Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to speaking with you and the audience.
First of all, we're going to just talk about why you're running for president. You know, a lot of people who are watching the race will look at it as a binary choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. If you don't have that realistic prospect of being in the White House in the eyes of a lot of people, with all due respect, what's the point?
Well, first and foremost, we owe it to the voters to have an option that's outside of that false political binary. We want to give voters as many options as they can in terms of candidates. And I feel it's very important for us to have the insight of the libertarian philosophy injected in this election. And whether or not we win in November, we can put the ideas on the table that we think need to be heard. And I think it's important to build up a party around the country and can actually truly build up to be a competitor, the Democrats and Republicans, in the long term.
How do you get that message out? Because you're up against two machines and they're spending a lot. Like, what's the strategy? How do you make that noise? How do you get that attention?
Well, one of the things you want to do is you want to be as active as possible. You know, I'm the first candidate for president, I think, that's ever traveled to all 50 states to campaign for the office. I think it demonstrates the energy and the vigor that we want to show in this campaign, as opposed to maybe the kind of more old school style politics of the Donald Trumps and the Biden and Harris administration. And yeah, we have to do a lot with very little. You're right, we're being very much outgunned in terms of resources. But when I ran for US Senate, my opponent spent $250 million. I spent about $20,000 and earned enough votes to force a runoff in that election and bring lots of news and attention to the Libertarian Party. I like to try to punch above my weight as much as possible, so we're very scrappy in the Libertarian Party. We're trying to speak to as many voters directly as we can. And yeah, there's a huge social media component. I think the area where our campaign is having the most impact is on TikTok, where we've had millions of views and shares across the spectrum. Of course, that speaks to Gen Z voters and millennial voters the most, which is our demographic that we're trying to target the most, because we want to actually think about how can we grow the Libertarian Party in the long haul. It's converting voters in their first or second election cycle so we can get them out of the kind of that false binary that we mentioned earlier. So I think voters are waking up to the need for younger candidates, and I'm happy to be that first millennial through the gate.
And what's interesting about that demographic specifically is you've got these low propensity voters, people who've never voted before, or who don't align themselves traditionally with a party like maybe their parents have done.
Oh yeah, I think independence is the largest growing political affiliation in this country. It has long been on the rise, and I think that's because the two-party system and their just kind of polarization and division have push themselves further and further away from where the average American is. So they don't feel comfortable identifying as one or the other, even if they may vote one way or the other or kind of switch back between elections. But I think it's that nature of independence that is really going to give a path for the Libertarian Party and others to actually grow over the long term if we professionalize ourselves, if we run great candidates and keep putting a really powerful message forward. And I'm an optimist. I think that's where we're headed.
I saw this quote where you were described as somebody who supports both the right to an abortion and a rocket launcher. I mean, that's a good headline, but what is it that you guys really stand for?
Yeah, so I'm a 39-year-old resident of Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a part of the millennial generation that saw my generation having to go fight the war on terror. That's my generation that saw the economy fall out from underneath us right as we were getting involved in 2008. And so we bring an insight that I think a lot of voters don't have. And as far as like, what is our party trying to aim? And I believe in make your own choice. If you're not harming anybody, if you're not committing force, fraud, coercion, theft, or violence, if you're not committing an actual harm against somebody, you should be in complete control of your life because you're exercising the most local government, your own self-governance. And if everybody was able to do that and not harm other people's liberty, there'd be no need for any other government. And so we as libertarians, we seek the message that, hey, you can control your own life so long as you don't harm anybody else. And if we do that, we can go about the business of cutting down this overly abusive and intrusive governing structure that robs us of our tax money, sends us to wars around the world, and generally invades our liberty and privacy in ways we don't like. Let's fight for a better world, and in doing so, respect the fact that there are a lot of different people who are going to live a lot of different lives. But if they're not hurting me and I'm not hurting you, There should be no need for us to involve the monopoly of violence that government creates. And I think by and large, most people are peaceful, and so there shouldn't be very much need for government to be invading the lives of nearly everyone.
What's a good number for you? I mean, obviously for any presidential candidate, it's the higher the better, right? But what would you say realistically is a good percentage for you guys to get?
Well, in considering over the last 4 years, there's been a concerted effort to try to minimize the impact of alternative parties in the process. I think if we can at least maintain our ground as where we were 4 years ago, and that is the kind of the floor of what we're looking for, is to have that impact. And of course, 4 years ago, Donald Trump blamed Joe Jorgensen for being the spoiler in the election. And if we can disrupt the political process and get that prominence, we're happy to do so, whether it's spoiling for Harris, spoiling for Trump. Someone's going to blame us in November for the reason why their preferred candidate lost, I'm sure.
You bring up Donald Trump, and on that subject, what is it about him and Kamala Harris that people, do you think, are drawn to? Is it the fact that they've got so much money that they can just blitz everything? Or is it personality? Because specifically with a lot of the Make America Great crowd, it does seem to be kind of personality driven.
Yeah, well, I think he's unique compared to maybe Harris or other politicians in that way, that he's definitely always been a creature of personality. He was a reality TV show, well-known celebrity amongst Americans. So we obviously had that kind of familiarity with Donald Trump. So there's a lot more personality driven there. But I think what drives voters to both camps seriously is just that conditioning that they are inclined to vote just Republican or Democrat and not view anything outside of that spectrum. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running, is to wake voters up to the fact that they don't have to limit themselves to these two choices, especially if you feel really bad and you're only voting for one to spite the other. I would much rather you find a candidate to vote for, and I'm hoping we can provide that option for voters and maybe change the way we think about this stuff.
Let's talk about how government looks. So we've had the first black president. We may be about to get the first female president. You're openly gay. Mm-hmm. Is America ready for its first gay president?
My answer would be yes, and I think that's because demographically we're seeing Gen Z rising, and among Gen Z, a quarter of the population identifies as LGBTQ across the spectrum. Now that, by and large, is people who identify as bisexual, whether in a same-sex or an opposite-sex relationship, what have you. But I think more and more people are being comfortable with the fact that, people live different lives. They may love somebody of the same or different gender, and that shouldn't really disqualify you from being in public service. I'm the first gay candidate for president across the country. I don't think I'm going to be the last. Dare say I don't think we're going to go very long without electing one at some point. And so I'm happy to be representing as like the first through the gate, but I'm certainly not going to be the last one that attempts this, and I won't be the last one, certainly. I don't think we're going to go very long in this country without seeing LGBTQ people elected to higher and higher office.
You've talked about the need for a ceasefire in Gaza, which is what a lot of politicians have talked about. But at the same time, at the moment, we're seeing the US building up its military presence in the Middle East. If you were in power, talk us through how would you achieve a ceasefire? Like, give us a breakdown, the first week, the first month, because it's got to happen quickly when you get in.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at why Israel has been able to continue its war in Gaza and now expanding into Lebanon, which has created 1 million displaced Lebanese, and why they're continuing to do this is because they know that the United States will fully back them without any question at all. And I think the first way you would start changing the behavior, what's going on there, is you send a clear signal that we are not going to be backing this behavior any longer, that we're going to be removing our military footprint from this region of the world, and that if you want to continue to spark the ire of people and to escalate conflict, that's not going to be done just because the United States is just going to back you up under any circumstances. And we have to put that pressure on Israel to pressure for a ceasefire. If for no other reason, the fact that there are still over 90 hostages that still need to be released as well, and it's not going to happen without a ceasefire. And you see Israeli families of these hostages right now pressuring the Netanyahu government to push towards a ceasefire. I think amplifying those voices can do a great deal as well to put pressure on the Netanyahu government. There's a lot of steps we can take, but it starts first and foremost by saying, as Commander-in-Chief of the United States, no, you don't get to tell us what to do, and you don't get to say that we're going to be involved in any action that you're going to take. We need to have a more measured response, which is what we should have been telling Israel on October the 8th, which is, we understand you have a right to respond to Hamas and the violence they've perpetrated against you, but the manner in which you're going to do this, the airstrikes, the displacing so many people, destroying billions of dollars of infrastructure, this is not a policy we want to see going forward. And so I think we need to exert our pressure as what they call their greatest ally. If we're going to be that, we need to be able to say, point blank, you can't continue this policy.
Well, I mean, don't you potentially cut out a large section of the electorate by doing that? Because there is a lot of support for Israel in sections of the US. I mean, Joe Biden can't seem to extricate himself from it. Kamala Harris, every time we get these readouts from anybody in the government, Donald Trump, who wants to be in government, or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, they always begin with that phrase, we give you our ironclad support, and then they go on to talk about the ceasefire. It's almost like that support is the first thing that's on mind.
Listen, my support is for the people of Israel. It's not for the governments. It's always for the people. My support here in the United States, my love for the United States is not for the love of the government of the United States, certainly. It's for the love of the people of the United States. And I have to look at what I think is the best policy to make the safest conditions for the average Israeli who wants to live in this, who wants to live there. And right now, the policies of the Netanyahu government are not doing that. They are further destabilizing the region, creating more tensions in the region, creating more conditions that might lead to a major all-out war in the region. And that is dangerous for the average person who just wants to live their life, raise their family, and live in relative peace and security, which is why you're seeing so many voices, even within Israel, crying out for a ceasefire and for a change in policy, because they don't want to see themselves falling headlong into a regional conflict that can lead to many more deaths than what we've seen. And so, my support is not for the nation of Israel, it's for the people who live in Israel, who deserve to live in peace and security. It's the same as I don't support Hamas, I support the people of Gaza, who are having to live under Hamas's governance, because they deserve to live in peace and security as well, and they've been let down by their government. In any instance, it's always the government letting down the people, and the government who are exporting the violence, and the government who are perpetuating war, and it's the people who suffer for it. And we need voices in our politics who are going to fight for the people, and not necessarily for the love or the support of a government. And sometimes you actually have to be quite confrontational to the government that those people represent in order to support peace in the region.
Speaking of confrontation, I mean, Donald Trump has talked about how he doesn't feel NATO is fit for purpose. When we saw the hostages released, the prisoners released recently from Russia, Kamala Harris talked about how it's important to have allies and have friends. Do you support the strategy of working with other countries to build these alliances, or do you support more of a America first kind of strategy?
Well, I think it's not as strict of a binary as that. I think what we can do is we can still forge relationships with nations around the world without strictly tying ourselves to conditionary allyships that says, if one nation is attacked, we immediately have to jump into the fray. Just as we did in World War II. We didn't have a NATO alliance that had a clause that said if one nation gets attacked, we jump in. Our nation and our national security was threatened. We naturally jumped in on the war. We jumped in with the allies, and we did what needed to be done. But you don't have to have this conditional framework to make that happen. In fact, I think that kind of forces us to be friends instead of actually doing the real work of diplomacy to actually forge the ties around the world that can actually bind and create peace. And I think that's a better way to operate.
Bring it back closer to home, put you on the spot here. Any predictions for November the 5th?
Well, I predict that no matter who wins the election, if it's not myself, we're going to have a candidate that's going to increase debt and deficits, that's going to have a foreign policy that's going to be rooted in militarism and exporting our value with the bombs, the bullet, and the drone. No matter who wins, I think between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, we'll effectively lose.
Would you ever consider doing an RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., part of the American political dynasty, who ran as an independent? He eventually threw his weight behind Donald Trump, and he's trying to endorse Donald Trump. Would you ever consider doing that for either candidate?
No, and I'll tell you, there's two reasons why. A, the Libertarian Party deserves to have a presidential candidate to help support the down ballot and help support the party's image going forward. And I think if we did that, we would be selling out. So I'm not interested in that. And in fact, I was asked the question at our convention, if a gun was put to my head and I had to pick Joe Biden or Donald Trump at that point, who were the two candidates, who would I pick? And I very quickly said the gun would go off. And I sincerely mean that. If those were my only two options, I'd be a non-voter, just like 40% of Americans who don't feel inspired to vote. And that's because they're stuck with only seeing two quote-unquote mainstream candidates, and everyone else is limited out. And I think if we had more candidates, we'd have more people coming out to vote.
And let's end it on taking it back to a place close to your heart, Georgia, where you've run for both the House and the Senate. I mean, Georgia is one of those knife-edge states, isn't it? Just fewer than 12,000 votes last time. It could go either way. How do you feel about the fact that you are potentially, and I hate to use this phrase, but a kingmaker? You could have a real influence here. What does that feel like to know that you could be in such a powerful position there?
Well, it makes me feel good knowing that the Libertarian Party has maintained itself as a party and created the conditions where they can be the difference maker in some of these elections. I really look forward to seeing what happens in my home state of Georgia. And of course, I hope to be that difference maker. I hope to beat the spread, as it were, so we can not only secure ballot access in my home state and run libertarians, great libertarians in the future, but so that we can continue to be part of this conversation and move the window of political opinion more towards the idea of liberty, individual sovereignty, and away from a government that would invade your rights and your privacy, especially if you're doing no harm to anyone.
Great. I mean, such an exciting time to be here, isn't it? Especially, I mean, it was described as the craziest election probably of our lifetime.
Yeah, it's certainly the most unique. You know, we've had candidates dropping out, we've had candidates being shot at, we've had candidates dropping out and endorsing other candidates. It's certainly been a unique election. I won't ever say the most important election of our lifetime, because that's the joke. Every 4 years is the most important election. But what I will say is I'm excited to be a part of this history in 2024, and let's see what we can do. The sky's the limit.
Yeah, never a dull moment, and who knows what could happen in the next few weeks. Thank you very much for your time, Chase Oliver. Thanks for joining us here on Center Stage.
Hey, thank you so much. Peace, love, and liberty to you and all of your audience.